Hello, and good evening, and welcome to the Commons Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club. We're in the month of June, and it's the day after the first day of summer. So yay that. We've got a great book this month that we're focusing on. It is MAMO by SAS MILLEDGE, who is right there. There's SAS. How are you doing?
Good. Oh, I'm unmuted. Awesome. Great.
Yeah, you are unmuted.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm doing really good. Yeah, I am. Like you said before, I am in the future in Australia. So yeah, daytime.
Yeah. Isn't the internet great that we can do these international calls like this and it all works fine? You know, like I don't know. I think it's really cool actually and magical.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. I'm going to knock on wood though to the it's all going to go fine.
Yeah. Oh, it will all go fine. It will all go fine. Fantastic book. Really love this book a lot. And we will talk about the book itself. But my first question is the same. We've been doing these, 8 years of shows here. And I asked everybody the same question because I like this question a lot. Why comics? Of all the things that you can be doing, and particularly because you have you studied for animation, you teach animation, as I saw on your website. It seems to me comics are an incredibly labor-intensive job and weird. And so why? So what attracts you to it?
So I think going from animation to comics is to me they go really hand in hand, in the sense that equally is labor intensive for equally a short amount of time that it takes somebody to consume it. But yeah, I think animation, it's about sequential storytelling as well. It's about, trying to communicate something to people with visuals. And while you have a little bit more control in animation with regards to sound, timing, and things like that, whereas in comics you have no idea how fast somebody is reading it or in the circumstances they're reading it amongst. But it's still a very similar kind of practice. And I think actually it probably translates for my work. That I think I tend to, I think you can tell I was trained in storyboarding because I do lots of really wide panels and I can't help but overact scenes as well, I think. And I really pacing is a really important thing to me that I think maybe I don't approach from a typical comic standpoint. But why comics? I always loved comics. I think I would have been it would have been a clearer trajectory for me if comics hadn't been as inaccessible as they were when I was a kid. It was manga in Borders and webcomics was all I had access to. And even then it was before webcomics, before we had Webtoon and HIBBS and all these things where you can access a lot of webcomics. These days, it was, people had them on Tumblrs or on their own websites or, just sort of floating around the internet. So, I think I probably would have come to the same conclusion sooner. But what happened is I, saw Avatar: The Last Airbender first, and I saw storyboarding, and I thought that's what I really want to do. And then I only figured out later that it was probably more conducive to comics because animation is really hard, and it makes comics seem easy, which is totally not true. Comics is hard as well. Comics is incredibly labor intensive. But yeah, I think you have a little bit more freedom with in animation. You have to fill in the gaps between what people can see. In comics, you can let people have a little bit more input. They get to read between what happens in panels and read between sort of the lines to understand action and kind of make assumptions of movement and things like that, which I think is really cool. I think it's a really interactive way to engage with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the impression that that animation was somehow easier because you had more people working on it.
That's
and
true.
More hands involved.
Yeah, I think probably the reason with animation being that's true in industry, I think, and that's purely because you have to, because there is so much to do.
Right.
And so while I shouldn't say that animation is harder. It's more that if you want to be an independent animator, that I think is harder because you are doing all your work. Anybody who's seen Thief and the Cobbler, Richard Williams, it is very hard to make your own thing in animation. You do have to collaborate a lot more with others, which means if you're a little bit of a control freak like I am, it makes it hard to sort of be able to really fully realize a vision. Whereas with comics, you do get to kind of be the master of your own world a lot. And while there is elements of collaboration, like I've collaborated on comics with people before, and that's been a really, really lovely experience. It's the sort of visuals that you have a lot of command over and a lot of control over. So that's sort of exciting as an artist, I think.
Yeah. Your CV shows that you did a couple of small comics, a decade ago, more or less. And then you started doing covers for like Boom. So what was the process between sort of in that time period of doing, assuming self-published material? I didn't recognize the titles, so
Yeah, largely self-published. So I was writing a webcomic for a while that it was the basis of what MAMO became, basically. I finished at animation school and was pretty sure I didn't want to do full-time animation, though I did work in animation for a little while because it was kind of where my contacts were and it was where my skill sets were. But yeah, I sort of just like was kind of like, I want to do comics. And so I'm just going to make as much as I can in order to sort of like have somebody see that I can do this, and so that I can apply for jobs or sort of like get an agent and like try to kind of like move in that arena. So I started the webcomic when I finished university, which became what MAMO became. It was pretty short-lived. I did it for like 6 months. And it was, very similar sort of concept, but like half-baked to what MAMO became. And then that is actually what landed me the job with doing covers and things with Boom, because they saw that and they were like, we really like your work. We don't like it enough to publish it yet, but we like it to do comics. And so that was like a really good foot in the door, basically. And then I was really lucky. I was working on a comic for Inktober in 2017, 2018, where it was based on Les Mis, and that was another sort of self-published thing that I was sort of like selling copies out of my living room, basically, like packing stuff up myself. And that is actually how I got the job with DC, because they saw that work and they said, we want you to do this, but for us. Which was great because I was just like making stuff I liked making. Like, it wasn't, it's very easy to be just like making something for fun. And somebody's like, can you do that for us, but for money? It's like, yeah, I was doing that for free. The
DC book is this one here, The Lost Carnival. Just for people playing at home who may not know,
Sorry.
A Dick Grayson book for the young adult line. Was the line at that point? I mean, did they approach you about doing the book, or did they come to you with, this is for a young adult line? If you see the distinction I'm making.
Yes. No, they absolutely came to me with the idea for DC Inc. because they were doing what I think is a really smart idea, because with all the success of like DC and Marvel movies, why can't we translate that to comics and comic book sales? And I think it is largely sort of like similar to what I touched on before, is that comics can be really inaccessible. Like, I think we're starting to get more awareness and more eyes on the work and more understanding that like, no, you have to go to a comic book store to get comics. But I think like it's really hard to translate, especially when you're talking about like floppies and like the direct market. It's really hard to get people, like that's a pretty high barrier to entry. And so I think the conceit with DC Inc. was to basically get like full graphic novels of introducing you to DC characters into Barnes and Noble, like in front of people who are kind of like, I've seen these movies and like, oh, I want to like, access this world. What's this? And you can get a whole and complete story that maybe gets you attached to Dick Grayson, Nightwing. And then you can kind of like use that as a diving off point to get into the sort of direct market and the sort of issues that are coming out now, kind of thing.
Sure.
So, and I think that was exactly like why they hired me into as well, is that they weren't trying to go for that traditional comic book style as much, which is definitely not my style. That's the thing. I think people are surprised when they hear I did a superhero book, because it's like, that's not really the kind of work I do. But that was kind of what they approached me about. They were like, we want to kind of have a wider scope of illustration. Like, I think, and if you look at a lot of the DC Inc. books, they're a really sort of diverse collection of styles, which I think is really cool. I think it's great.
Yeah, no, I do as well. It's interesting because I think that the evidence is still out as to whether whether that approach actually did much to bring in new readers compared to the direct market. And, obviously my bias is I'm a direct markets comic book store, so I'm very, very, very biased towards the way that we do business. But yeah, I think as a whole, when you look at the sales of the line, it didn't really crack it in the way that they were hoping,
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, the direct market is one of those things that's really, really special to comics. And it is so ingrained in the history of comics that like to get rid of it, I think would be just like totally, futile. Like it's what has made comics like as exciting and as interesting and as a transformative medium that it is. And I don't think any other medium is allowed to be as transformative or like changeable as comics is. And specifically what superhero comics do, where you can like just reinvent characters every now and again in a way that is like exciting. Like I think that's really cool. It's what I've always liked about like online fandom spaces or online kind of like community spaces where people are kind of remixing and changing stuff. Like it's cool that we have that on an industry level. It's just about like how do we like get young people through those doors without feeling like totally overwhelmed by it. And I think it's like creating comic book shops that are like exactly what you're doing. Like I have a wonderful comic book shop here in Melbourne that I love, that do direct market stuff, but are really good at getting people in the door and are really good at like talking to people, making them feel welcome, making them feel like they can sit and hang out and read comics. And like, like I think that's what's important, is that we as a community need to just be like really good and really welcoming. And I think the DC Inc. thing, like it was an experiment. I think it's a good experiment. I think we should try to sort of find a way to make it easier for people.
Of course.
That's what say the direct market.
I mean, I agree with all of that. I was just sort of speaking to the like, but did it work?
Oh, totally.
Because I think, I think that we've spent decades with particularly with Marvel and DC, just sort of assuming that the direct market was the be all and end all, and so not really promoting direct market stores or like even small stuff like, the television shows don't say based on the comic. That's all it really needs, is just, so that people know to look for them at comic book stores. It's a funny thing, But had you I saw you also did an issue of Buffy in there. Did you do that before this book or concurrent, or?
I think it was concurrent. I think it was towards the end of. Sorry, my dog is moving. Hi, Bobby.
Hello, Bobby.
I think he makes a cameo in MAMO, don't you, bud? But sorry, what was I saying? I think it was concurrent with DC. I think maybe towards the end of DC is when I was working on Buffy. And that was, like I had a relationship with Boom, and they had a really cool opportunity just to be like a guest artist on an issue, specifically about Willow. I love Willow, obviously. I'm a redhead. So that was really exciting and fun. And it's nice to be able to just like dip in on a project like that and then be able to, say you're a part of it without having to do all the really hard work of having to do like a ton of issues and things like that. That was a real privilege and fun to work on.
The experience between working on a single individual periodical comic and a graphic novel like this. I mean, if this is your first work, the DC book, and it's what, 220 pages or something like that. I don't know. That's a lot to do as your first piece of comics work.
Yeah, it was. I would say, what was good about that is that actually, like the work that I did on DC, I would characterize as closer to the kind of work that I used to do in animation, which is that you're kind of part of a pipeline, in the sense that you've got this huge support team of like editors, writers. We had a layout artist, we had a colorist. So it was really like, you were getting handed sort of work to do and then handing work on for other people to do. And so they had a really good schedule and deadline. They had really like the schedule that we had was like pretty forgiving, at least for the way that I was working. I think it was 12 pages a fortnight, which is pretty good. Like that's approximately like, if you're working 5 days a week, like 1.5 pages a day, which is just like pretty easy. And so like I found it like to be a really good starting point to have that much support and to kind of learn how to put together a graphic novel, because prior to that, I'd only ever done stuff just for fun for myself or for like issues. I think the first technically the first comics job I ever did is I did a short for the Jim Henson like Labyrinth like special a few years ago, also with Boom. And I think that was my first ever comics gig. And I was like so out of my depth. Like I really had no idea how to do that in a professional context. Like, you know, figuring out like, do you want me to do like thumbnails and then pencils and then inks and then like, or do you just want, you know, DC really allowed me to kind of like settle into that. And like, I had a lot of support. So it was not easy, but easier than one might expect.
Yeah. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the difference between doing a storyboard, right? Where you're not a storyboard isn't for an audience, right? It's for your producer and your fellow workers to understand how the story flows. Versus a comics page, you have to think about it very differently about like where what is on the page and how each page works as a unit and works together as the whole thing. Did that question make sense, or was I babbling when I said that?
No, that makes sense. I like, so like the sort of distinction between like working for like story for animation versus story for comics is kind of the question. Like I think it's absolutely different, and you have to keep those differences in mind. Like you cannot do a storyboard the same way that you're going to do like thumbnails or layouts for a comic. But I do think they dovetail really well in the sense of that, like, you're like, what am I trying to communicate to my audience right now? And like I said, with storyboarding and animation, you really have to indicate every action to sort of get that action across. There's very few opportunities for like kind of just like sort of implying action. You can do it, but it's harder and you have to be much cleverer about it. Whereas I think that, sorry, my dog is being a pain. Whereas I think that in comics and things like that, you can be a little bit cleverer and trust your audience a little bit more. You have that opportunity in that space. And so I think in terms of like, I would approach storyboarding very, very similarly to how I approach layouts, which is basically that like I have to send these off to somebody who has to approve them. So they have to be able to understand what I'm sort of trying to get across. And if I can't do that in a very sort of short amount of time, then that has failed. And it's not to say that like a lay person has to be able to understand layouts or storyboards, but like somebody who knows what they're talking about should be able to look at that and understand the story. But yeah, of course, you have to think about like speech bubbles, which is something you don't have to think about in animation. Animation, you have much more space to play with. But yeah, in comics, it tends to be like what's cool is you get to kind of, you can show really sort of like minute aspect to aspect stuff, or you can be jumping from like scene to scene to scene, and your audience will understand that, which is really, Well,
and even more so, the audience is equally a participant in the craft, right? You know, it's very normal when you're reading comics to stop, go back 2 or 3 pages and look at it. You don't do that when you're looking at animation. I mean, you could technically, right? You could hit the reverse button and do it, but nobody does that, you know? So.
Unless, totally. And it's like, and that's the thing with comics is you do just have to kind of relinquish that aspect of control. You have to just be like, okay, somebody is going to read this and they may look at it for 10 minutes or they may look at it for 30 seconds. Like, and I have absolutely no control over how they do that. And it makes it a little bit harder to like prioritize what you should be focusing on in your work. Like, so as a result, I think you end up kind of treating, or at least I do, not everybody does this. And I think I've heard from some very, very smart people who talk about like prioritizing action and prioritizing the scenes that they really want to work hard on. And I think that you can do that in comics really successfully. But it's something that's really easy and something that is really recommended in animation, which is that you save it for the money shot a little bit.
Right.
Whereas in comics, you are kind of like, you have no control over the sort of pace that somebody is reading something. And so you don't know how long they're going to spend with any panel. And so I do find myself like really conscious of that and trying to make each panel feel really, really rich and really interesting to look at, even if it's not, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be time consuming, but I am thinking about it in every panel. Whereas like in animation, it might be like, I just need to get this character from A to B, like, so that I can get to the cool shot. I don't want to, spend that much time. But I also should say, like, I don't animate anymore. I used to animate. It's very hard work, and it wasn't for me. So,
Sure.
But yeah.
Very good. It's always interesting to ask these questions. The other big difference between Lost Carnival and MAMO, obviously, is that one was scripted by someone else and the other was scripted by you. When I look at the two books, I feel like I can see in Lost Carnival that you're following someone's script, that you're. What elements you've been told need to be put in. You're trying to make them all pleasing and attractive. Whereas in MAMO, I really feel like you're in a lot more control of the page and the dialogue and where the flow is and what's happening with your eye. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yep. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's also like, it's not to say that when an artist and a writer work together, there is inherently less like ability for the artist to kind of do what they want to do. But like you, like depending on the relationship between the artist and the writer, that could be, and like every comic job is different. Some people will be really like, do what you want. Here's what I need you to get across. Or other people will give you like panel directions. And so like, I think it really, like for me, like I said, I'm a bit of a control freak. I really care about things like pacing, probably because I do think so much about like how people are going to read it and like how I can control their eye and where I can kind of like grab their attention in the ways that I want them to look at it, even though I aware that that's a fairly futile effort. So yeah, like I think when you are writing your own book, you can take the time that you need and decide where to cut things, or like when you believe that the art really needs to sing in a certain place. But like, I think with MAMO, I wrote the script pretty loosely. I had pages sort of broken down, but I never had panel directions. And even then I would come across like certain parts in the script as the artist. Like when you're in the writing mode, you're kind of like, this will work, this is fine. And like, I have absolutely no issue with like comic writers, and like it is incredibly hard to visualize what you need to get across in a page.
Sure.
Particularly if you are an artist, like even as an artist, as a writer, and then like writing something and then taking it and looking at it with an artist's eye, you're kind of like, why did I think I could get all of this done in one page? Like, I'm an idiot. Like, you get really, really angry with yourself. And it's just because you've got a different hat on, right? So yeah, like I had the real luxury with MAMO and with Boom. They gave me a lot of freedom with the book, which meant that I could just like move things around and change things up where I felt like it needed to happen, which really gave me a lot of control over being able to be like, this isn't getting enough space. I need more time here or more time there. And they were really forgiving about that as well. So that was ideal.
I'm wondering too about MAMO, because it was serialized, and it's it's a well serialized book. Each issue works very well as an issue. Was that at all a challenge for you to sort of to break your story into 5 really nice parts that all sort of stood on their own and yet connected? Again, I'm not sure if I'm asking the question right.
No, you are. Like, and it's a really interesting question, because like the answer to that is actually yes. So I wrote it as a graphic novel. It was originally pitched as a graphic novel. It was only after we were about halfway through the book that we decided to release it as issues. And I was really concerned because I originally had it broken up into 3 parts. So I kind of had like, the sort of first issue was the first part. The first issue was one of the longer parts. And then we had like 2 up until the Olive Grove, and then beyond that, or like up until Ola and Joe's fight. And then 3 was the sort of final part. It was like a 3-act kind of structure. And so I was really nervous when they wanted to do it for 5. But Sophie Phillips, my editor, like found really good places to break it up, and they did that in consultation with me, and I ended up pretty happy with it. I was concerned that people wouldn't take to it because it wasn't written as issues. And so like I think like the first, like, because it's a graphic novel, you can spend a lot of time just like slowly introducing characters and ideas, and like, whereas in a, like, I think there is pressure when you write a first issue of something to be like, I've got to grab my audience right now, like otherwise they're not going to come back for more. And so I was really nervous because I was like, my first like issue is like, we meet like 2 characters and then it ends on a cliffhanger of like kind of vagueness of like, we have no idea, like it's like I felt very, very strongly that it wasn't going to work. And then thankfully a lot of people have actually said that that's what they kind of liked about it, that it was a little bit slower, that the pacing didn't sort of try to drag you through it. So that was like largely luck, I will say, and then also well broken up like by my editor as well.
Well, if you ask my staff, they'll tell you that, you know, I was definitely raving about the first issue as a first issue, that I thought that it really was very effective as a self-contained unit. And in fact, when we picked this for the selection, I hadn't yet read the ending. Right, I hadn't read the 5th one. I had read 4 of the 5, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure she's going to stick the landing. But I didn't actually know until I sat down with the whole book. You know, long after we had picked it. In fact, so that I think attests to your skill in craft. That's
thank you very much. Yeah, it was like somewhat unintentional. Like, you're aware as a writer that you're like, I want to hook people in, and I want them to feel really, but like, I have a real thing of like, I don't like to launch people into action too quickly. I think action and like any kind of like, not so much violence, because MAMO is not a particularly violent book, but any kind of like high tension, high action really needs to be earned in a story, because otherwise, I don't know, it's like it becomes glib and flippant. Like, it's like, it's one of your, like, you know, that kind of tension is one of your most powerful tools as a storyteller. And so I feel very strongly about like not immediately launching into action, or if you are going to launch in, like, you know, you start in action and then but it's like, you need time to contextualize that and to really feel like the audience is like aware of where they are and then they're moving into something. So I was never going to change the first issue to like be more snappy, but luckily Boom were really willing to publish, I think what was it, like 45 pages or something like that as a first issue. So thank you to Boom, basically.
I think that was a really smart thing that they did there. On a technical level, the story is told entirely in dialogue, except for the first page of each chapter. You've got a caption on the first page of each chapter. Was that I guess added after the fact? Was that intention? Do you see what I mean?
Yep. So that was because of the issues that we had any captions. Otherwise, no captions. It was all dialogue. I don't know what my instinct for that is. I think that is largely just because like I personally haven't explored how captions can be really useful. I think they can if you were telling a story from, or like, at least this is how I think of using captions in a way that I really like, is to like, if you have an internal monologue, if you have a character who's your point of view character. MAMO is kind of like written in a way that I don't want you to know too much about Orla, and I don't really want you to know too much about Joe, because they're supposed to be learning about each other. And like, that's a really important aspect of it, is that we learn about each of them as they kind of reveal reveal themselves to each other. And so that felt really important, to not have like a kind of that internal monologue, I guess, if that makes sense. But that's not to say that's the only way you can use captions. I think captions can be a really powerful tool. I just like probably haven't explored the best way to incorporate them. And I think for MAMO, it was just the right choice.
Sure. No, absolutely. I was actually almost asking the question the other way around of almost like, why did you start with the caption on just page 1? Do you know what I mean? It really stands out on a reread that that's the only place that there is any caption at all, you know? And they don't kind of need to be there necessarily, you know? I think chapter 2 literally starts with "in Joe's attic." You know, that's it. 3 words.
Yeah, totally. And I think like that's the thing, is that I think the captions are largely were about like considering the direct market and considering people who are reading issues as like a kind of like, are we like to orientate people in the comics.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, like that was something, not to say I capitulated on, because I agree with them that you do sometimes, you're like, people aren't necessarily going to remember everything about the last issue, but yeah, they weren't there in the original script. And to a certain extent, it's a really hard balance when you're like in the process of writing and illustrating a comic, where you're like, am I hitting people over the head with stuff, or is this too subtle? Like, it's like, you can't, like, it's really, really hard. And I feel like a lot of with MAMO, like there is a lot of kind of metaphor, and there's a lot of sort of like stuff implied about relationships and implied about how magic systems work, but it's never directly like outright stated or explained in lots of ways. But then at the same time, I really worry about like there being like big aspects of exposition, and so it's really hard to find that balance. And I think like one of the reasons I strayed away from captions, like particularly through the rest of the book, is just because I want to trust my readers to be able to like navigate it and understand things, go back and read it if they haven't understood it, and try to kind of think. But like, I don't know, my mum read it and was like, it was a bit, I'm not really sure what was happening. But luckily 70-year-old women who have never read comics before are not my target demo. So
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I was really struck how you clearly have built a cosmology which takes from other things and other traditions, but is for this work, you know. And yet you don't really hammer us with it at any point, right? It's all sort of obliquely applied, if that makes sense, you know. It really made the book stand out to me, you know, in that way.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I think like what I was trying to do with the magic system in MAMO is like, I think you can have like two kinds of world building in many ways. Like, I think people get like really caught up on details in world building of like, oh, well, like this doesn't make sense with this. And it's like, well, but if it serves the themes and the story, then I think that's okay. Like, not necessarily knowing the limitations of how far magic can go, or kind of like the exact kind of trajectory of like, I think like it depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell. I think that can fall apart if you start like trying to expand upon that. I think I am not a huge Star Wars fan personally, but I think Star Wars is a really good example of this, is that like, I think the first sort of trilogy, and by which I mean the sort of 70s trilogy, so what is it, 4, 5, and 6, I think they are an excellent example of a world that has been constructed for a story. And then when you start to get into the prequels, you're like, wait a minute, this is maybe not holding as much water as I need it to, because it wasn't designed to be like a Tolkien-esque world where everything was planned from the start. It's not to say that that's necessarily bad, but I do think that like one of the reasons that original trilogy works so well is because it is like the Force, and the sort of the world that Star Wars inhabits is about serving its characters and about serving its themes, which I think works really well. And like that is what I would consider MAMO to be in many ways, which is that like the magic system is not designed to be like, you know, kicked in the guts and taken out for a spin to see like how it would apply to like the economics of the world or like things like that. It is about like, you know, it's like when people were trying to figure out like how much a galleon in Harry Potter was, it's like, who cares? Doesn't matter. Like, but like I think in MAMO it is about the purpose that the magic serves is to tell us more about the characters and their relationships, and that is their relationships to each other, as well as their relationships to their environment, and to their ancestry, and to their so like basically what I'm trying to say is that the reason is it's a little bit understated is because like there are elements of it that I understand, that I don't overstate, but for the most part, like what is there is what you need to know about it.
No, and I mean, I think things like, I just as one example, you know, sort of the bit about cairns, how you say it, with the stacks of stones, which are things, you know, which are real things, and you know, and have, but then that you sort of tied it into trolls or whatever. Like, it was very charming, and it was very, it felt real, it felt lived in to me without necessarily exploring, explaining midi-chlorians, essentially.
To go
back to your
Yeah, absolutely. I've just swallowed water badly, so I'm just going to mute myself and cough for a second.
Yeah, no, good. Do it. You know,
All right, I'm
you
good
didn't have
now.
to be that polite. It was, or you could have just coughed. It would have been all right.
All
Oh
good, all
man.
good. It's just that thing of where you're like, maybe I've got a handle on this. No, I don't
Yeah.
think I do. I
Yeah.
need to cough. Okay. Yes. So the cans is a really interesting one actually, because that was like one of the time, like I said, I was worried about like dumping people with exposition. That's the time where I'm really worried about dumping people with exposition in that scene. I think it's like 10 or 15 pages of them just like stacking rocks and like trying to make it visually interesting is really hard. And that was one of the problems I vaguely tried to solve in the script, but I had to solve much more in the illustration process. And so, yeah, like I'm glad it comes across as charming and interesting, because that's what I was really I was trying to keep it visually interesting while the audience is getting a lot of sort of text explaining things that aren't necessarily happening on page. But at the same time, I was trying to kind of reinforce the point of the plot with that moment, which is that like, Ola and Joe are building something together, and you know, like that thing is about sort of restorative relationships and like caring for others and things like that, particularly the environment. And yeah, like cans are so that idea came from like I traveled around Scotland a few years ago, and all the rocks there look like little trolls. So I think like that was sort of where that came from. But yeah, cans is something I love. They exist in like some kind, like sort of standing stones or like piles of rocks as like trail markers and things like that, like exist across like multiple cultures all over the world, if you sort of ever like feel like Googling them. And I think as like a kind of like sort of like showing people their way, as a sort of like an instance of like a boundary or of like humanity that has sort of like is represented there in some way. There are cans that people, the idea is that a traveler, when you pass, you put another rock on, kind of thing. It's this sort of collaborative boundary marker of travel and place. So it was really visually sort of appropriate and thematically appropriate for the moment. But yeah, I was, the truth behind that is that I was really conscious of info dumping. So that's why like that all kind of came together the way it did.
Yeah, well, it worked. Like I said, it worked. I thought it worked very effectively, you know, and it's you know it stood out in my mind as well, that particular scene. So you know that's great. Is there anything, because it looks to me like you did a reasonable amount of research about sort of witchy traditions, I guess. I'm wondering if there's anything in the book that's particularly Australian in origin, or you know, perhaps Aboriginal as well.
To an extent, yes. Like I was trying to draw like, so like one of the reasons the cans like was something that was really important to me was that you can find it in this kind of cross-culture aspect. And yeah, absolutely. Like I think like in the same kind of vein, there are things that exist in Australian Aboriginal culture that exist in lots of different cultures. I really believe that like the world in many ways, like people are the same the world over in many ways. And there are these ideas we all kind of circulate in our mythology and in our ideas, particularly the boundaries and the idea of like movement across landscape and things like that. So like things like ley lines in Welsh and Celtic culture, or like song lines in Indigenous Australian culture, kind of definitely influence those ideas as like a kind of important aspect of the text thematically. At the same time, I was definitely like nervous about like ever trying to be too specific with the kind of mythology I was presenting. Like I said, like I'm not that interested in constructing a whole magic system that is like based on any other kind of. It's much more about like I really believe that magic and myth. You know, lots of people like to look at like Greek myths and they'd be like, this doesn't really make sense, or this is really weird, or like this isn't consistent, or something like that. And it's just like, you know, I really believe that when people build mythologies and religions and anything the world over, it is more about the people that are experiencing those things than it is about the stories that they were telling. The stories are always serving the purpose of like the people that created them. And so too with MAMO, it was really about centering the characters and then building out from there and trying to find these ideas that I think are really universal. But yeah, there's also the aspect of like, there's obviously a huge environmental factor to MAMO. And there's a huge sort of like grappling with ancestry and difficulties from the past in relationship to country and to the environment, which is of course like inextricably linked to climate change, like the battle for land rights here for Indigenous people and Native people like all over the world. So yeah, like obviously that is intrinsically linked. But yeah, I would hesitate to say whether or not it is like super deliberate or specific. I want people to really be able to access and read it as a way. Like I like at no point would I ever deny that like I think it is largely like very much it is about climate change, but I also think that like I think all of those issues that we have is about like community and interpersonal relationships. Like that is how we build outwards to sort of like respect the world and the land that we live upon, I think. Sorry, that was a meandering answer.
No. That's great. I mean, that's exactly what I was hoping for. Let me pause here for half a second and just point out that if there's anyone who's watching the show, if you want to ask a question, you can ask it in the chat, and we'll try to get to your questions. Otherwise, I'm going to just keep talking because I'm good at that. I like talking. So let's maybe talk about the origins of the story. You said you originally did this as a web comic. How similar are the stories?
So the webcomic ran for about 25 pages.
Okay. So not all that similar then.
So not all that long, and not all that similar. It started very much with the same sort of premise, which was like two girls meeting outside of a town, and one needed help with a ghost, basically. The idea of like the sort of Orla as a hedge witch has always existed, like the idea of like, and like the idea of sort of boundaries has always existed within the text, and sort of like the idea of sort of travel and finding sort of liminal spaces and like the power within those sort of like elements of choice have always existed. It became less about that as MAMO evolved and became more about like the idea of returning, the idea of leaving, and sort of those states of kind of being. But originally it was like MAMO was a much less, I don't want to say sinister because I don't think she's necessarily sinister. I think she is, you know, a figment, to a certain extent, a figment of Orla's own insecurities and doubts and difficulties reconciling her grief. And so I don't necessarily think of her as sinister as much as I just think of her as kind of like, I don't know, a pain point. But in the original webcomic, she was kind of like a trickster sort of figure and a little bit kind of funnier. And it was more like a road trip. The idea was it was like a young girl being haunted by her grandmother, and her grandmother was kind of like sort of trying to get her back on track with her life. And she was sort of like, it was much more kind of young adult, like sort of difficulty, like finding place, which I guess like, you know, is where MAMO ended up. But yeah, it was much more like kind of like road trippy series of vignettes of stories. And the grandmother was kind of like a funny, silly character more than she was like, and I think what largely contributed to that change, because this was about a 3 or 4 year difference between like writing that original webcomic and then writing MAMO. And like the reason I stopped writing it is because I kind of like, it was the first comic I'd ever really like consistently drawn, and it was not very good, and I improved really quickly. And so by the time I got to like page 25, it was like, I hate everything I've done before this, and also this story isn't working. And so I just like uprooted and abandoned it. And then and like had been trying to think about how I was going to reapproach it, but like was struggling to. Whereas by the time I got to MAMO, you know, and like to a personal point, like my own grandmother had died under difficult circumstances in that time. And so like I was having like very different sort of thoughts about like what grief is and what like how it isn't always just like abject sadness and loss. Sometimes it is like, I had unfinished business with you, which I think can be, a really hard thing to process for people.
100%. Did you pitch it to Boom, or did Boom come to you and say, would you like to pitch us something? If you see what I mean.
Yes. Yeah. So they came to me and pitched. They asked me to pitch. They had seen, like I said, so my editor Sophie had originally found me to work on Boom covers through that comic online, which at that point I had abandoned. And she said that she really liked it and that she, liked to offer me work in. I think she actually approached me about Lumberjanes first, because I think Lumberjanes is sort of tonally very similar, and I'm a big fan of Lumberjanes. But she, a couple of years later, sort of was like, would you like to revisit that and pitch it as a book? And at the time, I was actually so still kind of feeling like that project was like a real, I wasn't feeling good about it. I was like, oh, can I pitch you something else? I have this sci-fi idea I really like. And they were like, oh yeah, you can pitch that as well. And so I pitched 2, and they were still like, no, we still like that one better. And to be fair, I think they were right. I think I was just feeling a little bit sort of strange about how I was feeling about it and reconciling it. And I think I ended up, really happy with the process and glad that I got a chance to revisit it. But yeah, they asked me to pitch, and then thankfully.
And at that point, did you rewrite and reformat that pitch, or did you sort of go, well, here's what I did before, and I'm going to go here with it? If you see what I mean,
rewrote the entire thing and redid all the character designs and I was like, if I'm doing this, I'm gutting it completely. I was probably quite, in hindsight, difficult to work with, because I was really just like, I don't care if that's what you want, I'm changing it. In the sense that I was just like, I felt really divorced from that idea by the time that we got to pitching. And so it was really just like, I really need to change this in pretty dramatic ways. And I was really fortunate enough that Boom have been incredibly flexible with me, particularly through the pandemic.
Sure.
I don't think it's certainly no secret, because you can see that in the publishing announcement and things like that, and the way I was talking about it on social media, this book was originally supposed to be finished in August of 2020. But there was an international pandemic, global pandemic, which just slows the process down, I think, both on the editorial side and certainly on my side. I spent a lot of time just doing a whole lot of nothing, I think, like everybody else during the pandemic. I did not have a creative bloom of well, I've got all this time. I don't know what I was doing. But so that they were very flexible with me and very, very, very allowed me to kind of really do what I want with it, which was nice and scary, but nice, honestly. How big, how long was your pitch? Not long at all.
Pages, a little small thing.
Because they'd approached me. I think my agent at the time was like, you will never pitch with anything this short again, which was, and she's right. Basically, I had never pitched a book before, and I'd asked them what they wanted, and they were like, we want a summary of the story. We want character designs. We want sort of bylines, things like that, and some indications of style and design and things like that. And so that's what I pitched. Maybe 3 or 4 pages of mostly pre-production work, visualization work, as opposed to as opposed to what I think I would a standard pitch these days would be, which is that you have all of that and then you have 10 pages of the comic finished, at a minimum, and a script. Basically, I didn't even have a script when I pitched. So
I hear from a reasonable number of cartoonists who are even like, oh yeah, no, I have 30, 40 pages that are part of, well, I don't know why you're drawing 30 or 40 pages if you don't know that you're selling them, but
well, it's one of those things where it's the silliness of this industry, which is it crosses this line of it's a passion project, and I want to do this regardless of whether somebody's going to buy it, but then also how unfeasible it is to be doing something when you're not getting paid to do it.
Exactly.
Comics are comics are hard. They take a lot of commitment and a lot of follow through to be able to finish something without the sort of thrust of the publisher behind you. And I know a lot of people, and I hope these models become more sustainable, are working for sort of online services that allow them to create webcomics where they get paid a bit, but like, yeah, it doesn't, like, me personally, I don't see that as a sustainable model for the way I work. And I think, like, yeah, I'd love to see it become better. But I think right now, like, publishing is the way to kind of like find the support that you might need to be able to do something like this. And it is, you really, like, you know, as much as I'm sort of like, I'm a control freak, I like to make stuff by myself. You know, MAMO would not exist without like a whole slew of people who were supporting me through that. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah. The you know, when you say webtoons and things like that, I mean, you know, I think it horrifies me sometimes as a person who sells comics for a living that, you know, that people are giving comics and hours of their lives to these companies, which may or may not ever pay them, ever, you know, and it's kind of horrifying and weird to me, because I think that if you're going to be drawing work, you know, unless you're purely doing it for yourself, someone needs to pay you for it. That's the point, right? I don't want to.
No. I like, look, if we want to rant, I can rant. Like, this is the thing. It's like, what's hard about this stuff is just that, like, we make fun of this idea of working for exposure all the time, but like, social media is working for exposure. Like, and people, like, you know, likes and reblogs and, you know, people sharing your work is like very validating. And it can lead to professional work.
It can, sure, of course.
But it will not pay your bills, and it will destroy your brain. Like, I say this as somebody who had like middling levels of success in 2014 on Tumblr. Like, you know, like, it destroys your capacity to sort of work in a manner that is about you, like, or at least it did for me. Like, I don't really have the sort of right brain for it, I think. But lots of people, I don't know, lots of people seem to find it a sustainable way to work in the short term. And I think that a lot of people then fall off that wagon. Like, lots of your favorite comic artists end up not doing that anymore after about 4 or 5 years. And if you ever go and figure out what they're doing with their lives, it's usually that they've either retrained or reskilled, or they are working with a publisher. And I think it's just because, like, you know, social media, for all it is touted as this idea of like artists have direct access to their audience. Like, it's like, you know, I love people who read my books. I want to talk to people who read my work. That's so exciting and wonderful. But like, it needs to be in a controlled capacity, and it can't be the reason I work. Or like, at least not for me. Like, it you know, to say like I make work for the people who read it, it's like, you know, those people are a big part of the consideration of why I make work, but like, they cannot be the be all end all. And like, you know, that world can't spin on their approval or their validation. And so like, I think like the social media model and the webtoons model, it's really tough for me mentally to think. And I think also the problem is that like, while you do see like these waves of artists who sort of end up leaving and they end up doing something else, there's always a wave of young 19, 20, 21-year-olds without wrist problems ready to crash themselves upon those rocks again, which is the problem. There's always going to be this endless amount of content, which is not necessarily going to create sustainable careers for people in this industry. And like, maybe sustainable careers isn't the idea. Like, maybe I won't be doing this in 20 or 30 years time, but like, I'd like to be if I can keep my body working to a certain extent. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I'll say as much. I would like you to be, based upon this work. I would like to see you continue to do comics, because this is really good. And I can only imagine that 20 years from now, you're going to be 20 years better, you know, hopefully. And it's right. And again, this comes from my bias as a guy who owns a comic book store, but I think of what I do and what my staff does as effectively being force multipliers for a work. You know, I often say to them that our job is to telekinetically set people on fire with our passion and our minds, and then those people go and set their friends on fire, and you sort of, you know, create this fire of, wow, we really like this book, and so we're acting as force multipliers so that more people can read it. And that becomes harder in the social media way of doing it, because the algorithms are not interested in promoting art. They're interested in promoting attention, which are two completely different things. I think that the members of the book club who are seeing this book for the first time, most of them probably would never have read it if we hadn't made it the selection of the book club, right?
Yep.
So ultimately, that's how you sell more of your comics, is by finding allies who are helping you, whether they're editorial allies or whether they're retail allies. I think the system works if we let it work. But that's again a whole nother rabbit hole that we don't need to go down.
No, I totally agree. Like, I think it's like, to the point before about talking about like comic book shops and the direct market, like I think that the only way we really sustainably like create a community and continue that community, because that community already exists, is by like having physical stores where people can talk and meet one another. And like I don't like, maybe, I don't know, maybe the VR will get good enough and it will feel like we have community online the way we do currently in person. But like, I currently don't see a replacement for like physical stores and like meeting people in person, having in-person book clubs, having and like obviously COVID is, I think if it's taught us anything, it's like it's really hard to sustain community and interest and passion over 2 years. Like I said, I barely made anything over those 2 years. So I totally agree. I think it's really hard. And like I think like I would so much rather have like, there's a lot I could be doing more to be promoting MAMO online. I'm aware of that. Like there is like, I have done like social media promotion and like done like sort of native engagement and things like that. Like I know how to do that. I grew up on the internet. The reason I don't is because it takes a huge toll mentally and it's a huge amount of time. And like, I would rather make comics and like have allies who do the selling and the loving and the passing it on to other people for me. Because I don't know, Twitter, man.
Dig that, man. Dig that. All right, so let's talk about, you've got a blank page in front of you.
Okay.
What's next?
So I have a couple of ideas that like are sort of stewing that I've been like promising my agent a pitch on for a while now. I am sort of in the process currently of negotiating something that I can't really talk about, but that hopefully I'll be able to talk about in a couple of weeks, which will be like most of the foreseeable future, which is like as a kind of like, which will be really nice. It'll allow me to kind of like sustainably work on something for like more than 10 months, which will be unique and strange. I've never taken on like a job for longer than that. So that's exciting. But yeah, like I am still like in terms of writing my own stuff and drawing my own stuff is like my main goal in terms of.
So that was actually, I'm sorry, I think I didn't phrase the question right. What I meant was when you sit down and you turn on your computer, right? Because you're writing the script first. You're probably not writing it on longhand, right? You're probably doing it on a computer. So you turn on the computer and you open whatever program that you're going to use, and you've got a blinking cursor blinking at you. Like, how do you motivate yourself to then make a thing?
Make a thing. Oh, that's hard. I think I usually start in like the Notes app. Like as a kind of like Notes app, or like while I'm driving taking voice things to like start in a really low stakes way of just being like bullet points of ideas of like, maybe this could be an idea. And then the blank page and Word document with a blinking cursor is terrifying. Like it's so like, you're like, oh, how do I start this? And like, you're like, okay, maybe I'll do the title, but then the title seems really formal. And so it's even harder to write after you write a title. So like, I don't know. Like, I think like largely I'm a real like spewer of ideas. I'm a real, like, I write things down before I ever draw anything kind of thing person. So I end up with lots and lots of like scrappy notes that I eventually open a new Word document with those all
Uh-huh.
open to keep me safe and protect me. And then I start like trying to organize them into a place. Yeah, I would never start script first. I think like I would start like outline and
Outline first. Okay. Yeah.
vibes first is kind of
Uh-huh.
how I
Uh-huh.
would go. Yeah.
I like vibes first. That's nice. That's a nice way of
Yeah.
describing it. Yeah.
Yeah, trying to figure out like themes,
Yeah.
genre, key relationships, things like
Yeah.
that before I start to like try and push it into a plot.
Okay. Okay. And then your scripts you said are relatively sparse. Not a lot of stage direction.
No, not a lot. I have a lot of sort of visual description of things, if that makes
Okay.
sense. So like in the sense of like I think like the script for MAMO starts something along the lines of like sort of like windswept hill, like kind of like birds wheeling, things like that. Stuff that didn't end up on the page, but like it's more about like creating a sort of sense of like
a mood in your head. Yeah.
Movement. Yeah. And so like it's about like kind of creating a scene, but then I never take that literally to the page, basically. Unless it's stuff that's really key. Like we see, you know, this character act this way, you know, where you need to get that across. But yeah, I am very fortunate when you write your own script is that you get to be like, I'm getting rid of that. I don't need that. Or I'm going to add this here.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah. Well, but you know, you've got to get it past an editor too. So, you know.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. I think I've been really lucky with Boom in the sense that I think they've just been like lovely to me and they've really allowed me to just like do what I like want to do. Which like I said is lovely. Really scary because you're kind of like, are you sure? Because like then everything's going to be my fault if it's bad. Like I'd love if you guys could give me some in the sense of that like it is a bit like when you do have that kind of freedom, it's a little bit sink or swim, like because it's kind of like you know, this is either going to be good or it's going to be really, really bad. And I have no idea which because I've been staring at this thing for months on end. But yeah, like I think like I've been really lucky in that sense. And I think I will miss it when it's gone. Like when I, you know, if I'm ever working on another project with a different team and things like that, like I will be sort of like, oh, remember when I used to just like cut stuff while doing layouts or while doing inks? It's gone. But anyway.
Well, you may find if you know your next thing is something that you're working 10 months of the year that you may not have the luxury to cut stuff also at a certain point. You know,
I designed MAMO in a way that was so like you know could be kind of refined down and to be a really simple story. Whenever you need to get like a lot, like MAMO does not have like a huge amount of plot. Like when there's any other, like I see comic books that have like a ton of plot in them and I'm just like, wow, how did this person do this? I would have like been so panicky about how much information there is to get across because I always want to take my time and sort of, you know, show lots of sweeping shots of trees.
There's even a point in MAMO where it's probably somewhere in the second issue that I thought, oh, so what she's going to do here is she's going to do the quest of the 12 bones and do like each of the bones individually will be an issue, you know. So you know, there's ways to make that kind of a thing work too. I'm glad you didn't end up going that direction, you know, that you swerved hard after that. But there was a minute where it really felt like you were trying to set up a recurring plot line in it, you know. If you see what I mean.
I definitely considered that as a kind, and like I think that was like one of the ideas of the original comic was kind of like this idea of having like a series of quests as a kind of coming of age thing. But yeah, MAMO became like part of it is time and like how much time I had with MAMO, but also just like I wanted it to be made clear that it wasn't like that wasn't the only problem they were facing basically and the bones were kind of an aspect of it. Like the bones mostly exist for the finale, right, which is just the kind of trick at the end. So while they are useful to the construct of the story, I was never I don't think I had the opportunity to go on like a 12 issue bone quest. The town's not that big.
You said it was originally pitched as a graphic novel, as opposed to a serial. How many pages was it going to be originally?
I think it's so like what did it end up at? I think it ended up at like 199 on 198. This
Something like
isn't
that.
labeled, so it's fine.
Yeah, you don't have page
But
numbers.
yeah, I think it's like 198.
Okay.
I think it's like 198 or 199. I
Yeah.
think it was originally 201. So I think I ended up cutting
Okay.
pages, which is
Okay.
yeah. But it might have been I cut a couple scenes
Yeah.
where I thought like it wasn't working or yeah. I
Okay.
think because we were about halfway through when we decided to go to issues, it's possible that in the later issues to sort of smooth over some transitions, I either added or got rid of pages then, but I can't be quite sure. I can't really remember.
Okay.
I do remember doing some sort of adjusting and changing things
Sure.
around there. But,
Sure. Okay, so you've got your script. You're gonna do thumbnails next, yeah?
Yep. Yeah. So yeah. Sorry, continue.
No. You were about to make a thought, so go with your thought, and then I'll ask a question.
So I don't my thumbnailing process is like truncated with my pencils. I just do what I call layouts. Is essentially like I have some available that I can show to you.
Sure, yeah. If you can hold them up to the camera. Oh yes, you can share your screen. There's a button down towards the bottom that is share screen.
Do you see it? I'm going to have to give my computer permission to do that. It'll be 2 seconds.
Yep, no problems. Take your time. It's all good.
Okay, there we go. Oh no, it's going to make me quit Chrome. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah, so basically my layouts are a like fairly quick sketch scene that quite sort of literal sketch that I find really thumbnails. I get why people do them. I understand them. But I find them like I really just want to jump. Like I find like I want to add more information as I'm there because I'm having ideas, and I find it harder to like be like, okay, no, I'll think about that later. Like I find it easier to kind of have a sort of truncated version of pencils and thing. But it's also because like when I go to pencils, if I go to thumbnails and then pencils, my pencils end up really tight. And then when I go to ink stage, I feel like my inks become way too rigid. I like having a layout that's relatively loose that allows me to kind of like make some stuff up as I go along while I'm illustrating stuff. 1 sec. I'm going to shoot you an email with these files, and then you can show them maybe your screen. Is that going to work?
Yeah. Well, yes. You'll have to send them to me. Then I'll have to send them I don't know how to make that work.
Oh, don't stress about it. It's not. Don't worry
There's
about
probably a way to make it work, but you will. It's all good. It's all good.
Bugger it.
I'm going to infer from your answer there that you're working physically and not working digitally.
No, I'm working digitally.
You're working digitally. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I work exclusively digitally.
I see. Okay.
Is I usually do layouts like on an iPad, usually sitting at a cafe or sitting on the couch, or sort of like I try to make layouts are relatively like I'm just hanging out and I'm just drawing stuff. It's like low stakes, like I find like that mental space is really like as soon as I sit down at the desk, I'm very like, well, this is serious. So I tend to work very like largely on layouts in a kind of casual way. So I do them on my iPad, so it feels a bit like you're working with pencils. But no, I work exclusively digitally these days. It's so strange. I used to be like very much a fine artist. I used to do a lot of painting. I used to not really like digital work, or I would like finish stuff digitally, but not never draw first digitally. But I don't know, just changed over the years. So yeah.
The only reason I drew that conclusion was because you specifically talked about a stage of inking, and most of the people I talk to who work digitally have indicated to me that inking is not a separate process anymore. That it's inking kind of is the penciling now.
Yes, and so I think that's maybe what I'm talking about as well, which is just that like I know people who do thumbnails, pencils, inks, all digitally. But I, personally kind of, and like, to be fair, I think publishers are on board with this now as well, because I've never had any pushback when I've said that that's what I do. Like, it's like, I do layouts and then I do inks. And I'd prefer to give you to give me most of my feedback during the layout process. Like I give you enough information during layouts to do that feedback. But it's like, I don't know, it depends on how expressive your style is, I guess. Like some people have a much tighter sort of inking style. And the reason I say inks is just like it's a phrase, I guess, that you use. But line art essentially, or you could call it pencils, which is just like I tend to declare my first pass my best pass. I think that allows me to stay relatively fluid and expressive with my work. Otherwise I feel like the more I overwork something, the worse it gets. I think like if I have to spend too much time with something, I start to hate it.
How much time do you spend thinking about sort of the structure of the page versus just the fluidness of the panels?
I think
and
I
by this,
simultaneously. Sorry. Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, by that, I might mean things like the page turn, right? That at the bottom of every, right-hand page, you need to have something that makes you want to turn the page,
Yeah.
Just as one sort of narrow.
I think about them sort of simultaneously a bit. So when I lay out, I always have like my page layout like clear. So I have like pages that are going to be a spread next to each other and things like that. I don't think a ton, like unless a page is specifically a spread, I don't think a ton about how my panels are matching to the other page, unless I feel like there's some tangents happening, in which case I sort of try to keep an eye on that. But like for the most part, I focus on like trying to guide the reader through the page. And then if it leads them back, like I believe that if I can lead somebody off to the page to the right, then it'll lead them to the next page at the top. But I do think about that sort of like simultaneously. I have the problem of like, I feel like lots of people have this. I certainly like, I have students who I teach comics to who like, you start them on layouts and you're like, you need to do like a ton of passes at this because you're going to get it wrong the first time. But people start like, there's a John Mulaney sketch where he talks about like when you're writing a birthday card and you do like a big B and a big I and a big R, and then suddenly you have no room for everything else. Lots of people have like a real like problem of like top heavy pages, and then they're oh, and I've got to get all this done at the end. So I tend to like try to approach it from like, what's the most important thing I need to get to on this page? How am I leading them into the next page first? And then kind of keep that mental idea in my mind, and then start to try and move panels around. And like I do lots of sort of cutting and moving and shifting and things like that until it looks right, basically. Simultaneously, I think is better.
Okay, no, good. It's I love asking these questions because every cartoonist does it a little bit differently. And it's kind of the thing that to me is the thing I love the most about cartooning and talking to cartoonists is that there isn't a rule. There's not one way to do it. I don't think it's as true with say prose or with animation, right? Where there's a structure that you have to kind of follow in those fields to conform somehow. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it exists as much in comics to me.
I think like I think maybe technology is what's transforming it a little bit in the sense of like animation as well. Like things are changing there in the industry and in production flows, and it's like I've been on like it's a bit of a, not say it's a mess, but like you move from studio to studio and each studio has like a different practice and a different production flow that they're trying to like get on top of as they hire all this new talent on. And depending on the program they're using it can like the way you do things. Like I've been on shows where it's like each section, like props, characters, backgrounds are all totally different departments and you don't talk to each other. And I've been on shows where like you have an umbrella of design and you're doing backgrounds, props, and characters as the designer. So it's like, I think like all of these industries that are expanding, like I think animation and comics are expanding. We're getting more and more artists and we're getting more and more, like, I think we're seeing like more eyes turning to it. But like with that, like accessibility of tools. So like, iPads and Cintiqs and things like that becoming more known and understood has meant that like different workflows are kind of like evolving out of that. And I think, traditional publishers just have to kind of like go with it a bit, depending on how.
I mean, especially considering that you can work from home these days legitimately and send things in via the internet. I mean, when I started in comics, 40 years ago, you had to send your stuff in on paper via FedEx. You had to physically mail it into the publisher. That no artist, in 1989 had a good enough landline to be able to scan their art and upload it. Heck, I remember back then, like art used to render one line at a time over the internet.
Oh yeah, no, I do remember that with dial-up and good grief. Back on the days, 2003 DVR.
Right. Which isn't even really that long ago, really.
I know, realistically. I mean, it's when, like, I remember it when I was on the computer, I was on the internet, like, way too young, but, like, I remember it, like, I sort of, like, 2002, 2003, like, trying to load cool fan art of like, I was really into, like, the Redwall books when I was that age. Just, like, pictures of mice with swords would take hours to download. But
one line at a time.
That's funny. What was the question? I think I had a
No, I don't know that there was a question there. I think we just got distracted.
No, what I was thinking of was that when I got the contract for DC, I remember there was a part of the contract that was like talking about sending in physical pages and like whether or not you could get them returned to you. And I was just like, well, I'm not going to be doing that. Like, which is really funny. Yeah.
Well, but on the other hand, the cover for Dark Knight #1 just sold for $2.4 million, which it couldn't have done if it hadn't been a physical object.
Exactly. And
if it was only a digital object, you're probably not going to be selling your original art, is my guess.
Totally. Yep.
So.
I've had a bunch of people, I've had a few people email me being like, are you selling pages? And I have to tell them, no. Like, I mean, like I can print you out one and send it to you for printing cost. But like, you don't have that same value. But I think like in the terms of time cost.
Sure. No, absolutely.
Probably too. Yeah. I know people who do stuff digitally, traditionally, and they are incredible. They do. It's a superpower I don't have, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's all good. You do your own lettering, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Is this a font based on your handwriting, or are you hand lettering?
So it's a font that I made. Yeah, it's based on my handwriting. I designed like a specific font for it. I probably won't use it in other comics that I make. Like I usually design a custom font. I just did a book for the Shortbox Festival, like the digital online fair last year, that I designed an entirely new font for. Which font is really fun to me. So I like making those kind of choices.
Totally out of curiosity, because I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to ask someone this question. How long does it take to design a font?
It depends. Like the one for MAMO was pretty easy because it's not too distant from my handwriting. Right. The one that I did for this other one, this is a bit spooky. The Son of Sam letters are really like, they've got this insane kind of like lettering in them. And the book I was writing was a horror book. And so I used that largely as inspiration. And that was quite difficult to like make it both legible and kind of consistent, and like using a kind of like something that was very, very abstract from my own handwriting, but also trying to make it have a kind of handmade feel, which is like the sort of joy in making your own font. And like with comic books, you generally do have a standard of like, even when I see people using like standard like kind of serif fonts, sans serif fonts, but even then they've added a little bit of like a wiggle to them that just like gives them slightly more kind of textured feel, like which I think, I don't know, like obviously there are comics that don't use like a hand-drawn font or a font that mimics hand drawing. But I think it does seem to be a bit of a trope in the industry. But which is not to say you couldn't do it in other ways. But I do think that making it feel, for me at the very least, in order to make it match my art style, I think I try to keep pretty expressive and pretty loose for the most part. It's important that the font kind of matches that and echoes it. Yeah,
it's one of the things that makes lettering invisible if it matches the art. If it's there are definitely comics that have come out where it's clear to me that people have used a commercial font, and it often is jarring in the work. There's some grit there. There's just friction between the art and the lettering in some fashion, you know.
Absolutely. And font is one of those things that, it's like sound design. If you don't notice it, if it's good, and if it's bad, it ruins the piece.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
Did you when are you starting to lay out your lettering then? Are you doing it at that thumbnail stage as well, or are you doing that more at the inking stage?
I do it actually. I was doing for MAMO, I did them absolutely last, like dead last.
Okay.
Did
Interesting.
Bubbles and lettering. I know people who do it at thumbnail stage, not necessarily final bubbles, but like final text placement.
Yeah.
I do plan my text, like my bubbles and my text placement in the layout stage, like pretty thoroughly. But I am still guesstimating a little bit. Like I'm like, I can sort of assume how much this is going to take. And then what I do is, this is so nightmarish actually. I like number I don't even put in the like final lines
Dialogue.
that are going to be in there. I just like number them, and then I number the script. So it's a nightmare for the person reading my layouts. They have to be like, okay, so that says 1 and that says this, and that says 2 and that says that. But yeah, luckily, again, my editors that I've worked in the past with have been very fine with that, which is nice. But yeah, I would be very open to doing lettering at the layout stage. I don't know if it would be final lettering because, again, you don't know how the art is going to change. So that would be my reluctance to do that, because I think placement of lettering is a real sort of like final thing for me. Like, I think that's when it looks best. And
so let me be clear. Does this mean, if I heard you right, that you've drawn all 200 pages before you've actually put down any of the words?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Well, with MAMO, because we were releasing it as issues, I'd certainly done all the layouts by the time the first issue came out, but I don't think I'd finished the colors and inks for most of them. So, or not most of them, like for the back half. I was lettering in the first issue when I was like inking the fourth issue and things like that. But that was purely because of issues. Like generally, you ink an entire book. You could break it down into batches, which might help. But no, I do it in a kind of, now I say it out loud, it does sound absolutely.
No, it's not. I mean, it doesn't sound odd per se. The oddest one was probably Dan Clow's. We were talking about Patience, which was, I want to say, 400 pages, and he said that he starts at page 1 and goes from page 1 to page 300, 400, whatever it was, all the way through with pencils. Then he goes through all the way through with inking, and then all the way through with lettering. So in other words, he's restarting the book. He does 5 different passes on the book, but each one only doing one part of the book. And I that was like, I couldn't wrap my head around how you maintain your own interest in the work, after a certain point,
Yeah, that's a good. So I would say I work the exact same way. The only reason with MAMO that I didn't do that is because we had to get out to issues. So it's like, well, I can't be inking this right now because issue 1 needs to go out,
right.
a month. So, and to be honest, what would I say about that? Like, is that a good way to work? I don't know. Like, I'm very open to changing that process.
I'm not trying to get you to change. Just, I'm curious. I'm curious about the good and bad parts of it, because I'm sure that there are good parts of it. I wonder about the bad parts a little,
Yeah. I think the bad parts are absolutely there. You're exactly right. Like that you can start to lose interest. I think the main reason you do that is because it is the easiest way to achieve consistency. Because if you are doing like inks, letters, colors, everything, one page, and then doing all of that for the next page, and then all of that for the next page, and all of that for the next page, you're going to end up with looking 2 very different products by the end, because your work evolves regardless. And maybe a layperson wouldn't be able to tell, but like as an artist, you can tell and you hate it. And so like as a result, it can kind of help to sort of like be doing like all inks, all colors, just for a consistency perspective. But you're exactly right that like coloring in particular is so unbelievably dull. Like, especially like it's fun in the sense that you start the scene and you're like, oh, I get to choose new colors for this scene.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then for the rest of the scene, you're just color picking and filling.
Yeah.
And it is bananas boring. And so
Yeah.
my coloring phases is where I like put on 12 documentaries about like Mount Everest for a month, and like
Okay.
it's just what I'm doing.
And
you're barely there emotionally.
You might like this. Last month, we interviewed a Nellie Furmark for Walk Me to the Corner. A Nellie's process is that she starts with the color. She does watercolor on the pages. She hasn't written a word. She doesn't know what she's going to draw. She has no script of any kind. She does the color first. Then she lays out the panels, and then she just starts drawing and sees what happens. And then I'm like, but don't you like throw stuff away? And she's like, oh yeah, I throw stuff away all the time. I throw whole pages away that just didn't work, like sequences that, no, that went nowhere. Okay, start again. So there's a million ways to do comics, is what I'm saying, and I find joy in that. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Your palette here is really pretty.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I think that flexibility comes from the fact that you've got one person who is just like spending thousands of hours with something, and their whim is the only thing that is like going to get that thing done, and so you do what you feel like doing. So, and you have the luxury to do it, even if it doesn't make sense to other people.
I agree. I absolutely agree. I was going to ask you about the rosy cheeks that every character has. Every character has not just rosy cheeks, but they literally have circular things on their cheeks,
like humble dolls.
Was that an intentional thing? Is it a style thing?
I think it's a style thing. I've just done it for a really long time, and it's something that I now just do instinctively, like things feeling complete without it for me, which is really strange. And like, it's to be fair, it is particularly stylized in MAMO. Like, it is very like they have big splodges on their cheeks. It's very Hummel doll. It's very like it's a way to bring a bit of warmth and character to somebody's face for me a little bit. I would probably do it in subtler ways with a different style, like but I would still always probably have that warmth there. Like, to me, it is more important than having like shadows or shading on a face. Usually is like bringing in an element of depth that way. I don't know. Yeah, it's a style choice, but it's also something I've always done. And it's like, it's always interesting when people point that stuff out to you. They're like, why do you always do this? And you're like, I don't know. I like it.
What about the animal actors, the familiar, the scenes with the ravens? There's a lot of acting on the page that they're doing, which is separate from the body language of the humans. Yep.
That was like a really conscious choice. So the way like the KATT Sith acts towards Joe is like deliberately foreshadowing the way that Orla will eventually start to feel towards Joe. Like, I think like Sith approaches Joe before Orla does, kind of thing. The Karawongs and the birds are all there to kind of give this impression of like watching, observation of this idea that like the world around Joe and Orla is alive, and it is paying attention to them, and that their actions matter and things like that. So too with sort of Mamo's moths as well. Like, it's the implication is largely I think it is a little bit getting inside of Orla's head more than anything, like the way the animals act, because she is the one who's most kind of aware of them. And then the surprise when she realizes that Joe is actually like familiar and friendly and like aware and of Karawongs, but also like familiar and friendly with them, sort of surprises her, because she sort of I think feels like she has a monopoly on this idea of like, well, the world is living around me, and it like where she sees sort of threat and potential isolation, or sort of potential rejection by things, and feels watched. Joe feels very at home and feels very familiar with things, and like, no, you can just ask people things, like that's fine. And that's the kind of differentiation of like that point when they meet the Karawongs is the sort of point where they both kind of start to see each other for what they are a little bit, which I think is like a little bit of fun. So like the animals, are largely about telling their own kind of internal story. Same with the trolls that we were talking about before. The trolls are about like they're partly there to entertain and to be funny and silly little things. But yeah, like they're there to kind of give this impression of like the world is alive around these girls, and what they do matters.
Does it help you, I don't know, kind of keep yourself entertained when you're drawing pages? And what I'm asking, I think, is that human reaction to one another tends to be very similar. Do you know, like in terms of how you move the camera and how the humans are framed looking at one another, but the animals and the trolls and the things can do anything they want to in the page.
And that is exactly, like that is really fun. And like the fact that they can, like the Karawongs in particular, like they can just be kind of like black shadows, and the moths as well. Like there's a really inherently kind of transformative aspect of their shape that it's just like I get to use them in a compositional way.
They come together really and then they go apart, and very powerful stuff. Exactly. No, great stuff, man. Great. I loved it so much. Hey, thank you so much. Did any questions come up, Ben? I saw that there could have been one, maybe. Anything that you think I should ask? He's okay. From Jordan. Ooh. Oh, Jordan, our producer. Do you like starting at the beginning or at the end?
I like to know where the end is, but the beginning is very important to me. Like, I think, that I usually get an eye for a starting scene of like how we're going to meet these characters. So like the one thing that is almost totally unchanged from the webcomic that MAMO started as to MAMO is like the first 3 pages of Joe meeting Orla is like that existed. Like Orla in the back of the car, Joe approaching on a bicycle, like existed from day dot as it just kind of like this idea of somebody living by the road or living in the boot of their car, I guess. But so the end is really important because I like to know what I'm headed towards. Like unlike the artist you were talking about before, where you can kind of just like see where things go. I am not a see where things go kind of gal. I love to know where things are going. Even if I'm very happy to kind of be weekly in between there and getting there. But I like to, the sort of, I think the answer would be like, I like to know where I am at the start, and I like to know where my characters are going to get to, and everything else is kind of gravy. You can figure that out later.
Makes sense to me. Anything else, Ben? Or Ivan Borodin, who works at Boom, yes? I think. Greetings from Los Angeles. I enjoyed MAMO a great deal. May I ask, what was your process with the art? Did you work exclusively on the... We asked this question already. You work exclusively on the computer to sketch, draw, and paint? It's on the computer.
All digitally. All computer. All Photoshop, except for like I use layouts. Like I use Procreate for layouts, basically. But Photoshop is my friend, even though I teach students who are all on their iPads and they're always like, we hate Photoshop. And it's like, I know, but it's useful. Anyway.
That's fantastic. Such an old woman. All right. So let's start the wrap up here. Let me ask, the book ends with "She'll be back." Do you see revisiting these characters?
Not really, if I'm being honest. So the "She'll be back" is like it only in hindsight did I realize that was like maybe like hinting at a sequel. Right. In the sense of that, like
thematically it works. Thematically it's
it's a thematic choice rather than like the idea of like sort of cycles and kind of even when you are moving, you eventually come around to the same place again. It's not to say that I'm totally against the idea. It's just that like I haven't really like I'm very happy with ambiguity in endings. I love ambiguity in endings. And I like it in my own stories. And I know that people like there are certain you know, people who I won't name on Twitter who like to spend a lot of time like adding stuff after they finish their books and kind of being like, oh, and this happened and this happened. I don't really have that. Like I have a few things that I'm like, oh yeah, we almost went that way, but I believe that what is on the page is the canon, and that is what happened, and anything else is kind of like up to anybody else, and like I don't want anything to do with it. So like as far as a sequel goes, I can see where I might go, like sort of blank, like I think Michael Chabon describes it as like blank pages on the map, like you're like things that like might be interesting to explore. But for the most part, Ola and Joe, I feel like I set out to answer the question that I asked at the beginning, which is who's the Witch of Hairsden? And I answered that at the end. And that was the only, like, whatever questions came up beyond that, I don't believe that's my responsibility necessarily to answer.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Sure, absolutely. I know I certainly wouldn't mind finding out 10 years from now how, you know, like 10 years have passed, what has happened, you know? That I would love to see that actually, you know? But in staying with those questions, what being the witch there means 10 years later. Joe is clearly going to be a different kind of witch. What happened with that? You don't have to answer those questions, but I can see there being a story there somewhere, you know?
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely agree. Like, it's not to say that like they don't exist beyond where they are, like where they are at the end of that. Like, I absolutely believe that like there's a, there's a story there, and that like it's just like in terms of whether it's a story I feel needs telling, I guess. Like, it's not to say like I think Joe would be a really different witch, and I think there would be real interest in different conflict there. I would just have to be able to figure out how to make that. I think the thing with sequels, what's hard about them is you want a continuation of theme, but you also want your characters to grow and to find new problems. And so like, because my theme is so rooted, like the themes are so rooted in kind of like relationships and things like that, I think it would require engaging with new characters and engaging with new kinds of issues that are perhaps outside of Hesden. I think like if I think about like where I see a sequel going or where I see a story going on, it's probably to do with Orla, and Joe would be involved in some way, but like it's one of the things. It's not to say like Joe's a good witch and she's finished and like her story's finished at all, but it's more that like I feel like the central problem of Hairsden has been solved in that moment, and I don't really know where their problems would reach. It's like not to say that it's not there. I just like
I think I would suggest that there's that boundaries change over time. I think is what I would say.
Yeah.
So how does Joe deal with whatever the new boundaries are? You know?
Absolutely.
And how does that change her relationship with the rest of the world? You know?
Yeah.
That's in my head, that's where it goes, you know. But
cool. Which is like that, and that's the thing, is that like I think that wherever it goes in your head is as equally as valid as where it goes in my head, in the sense that it's just like, like that's like, I don't know, that's what I want to be in the hands of everybody, everybody else, I guess.
Is there anything that you're working on now that you can actually talk about? Because you mentioned that you a little early for some of it.
A little early for some of it. So stuff I can talk about that's not under any kind of NDA or contract yet. Is like there's a sci-fi thing that was the thing I wanted to pitch instead of MAMO, which is kind of I've been reading a lot of Ursula Le Guin, and so it's very Ursula Le Guin inspired. Which is cool, like very sort of I don't know, without trying to be like too grabby with Ursula Le Guin, like it's just like, I just want to take all of everything you do because she's excellent at everything she does. But kind of like ones who walk away from Omelas kind of stuff that I've been working on for a little while, and like I have some very clear characters for, but it's like one of those things where it's like I know where the characters start and I know where they end up, and I'm not sure how long the middle part is going to be. The other is the book the short comic Barn Owl that I did for Shortbox last year is kind of a thesis project for a longer book, which is like, it's kind of like a prologue to the idea of a longer form book, which is like about, it's again, like, this is my problem with that one, is I'm like, oh God, I keep writing about small towns and dead people. But it's, it's set in like a small mining town in Australia, and features another undead kind of creature. And then, and then I've got another story sort of brewing about like a kind of like a sort of homage to like 80s and 90s slasher horror films and VHS stores and blockbusters and stuff like that. Because I'm a big horror fan, and I really want to try doing something a little more horror based. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I can't wait to see the next book. You know, I hope we don't have to wait a long time for it, honestly.
So do I.
You know. What's your output like? How many pages a day do you do?
It depends on deadlines. I can, and it also depends on style actually as well. So DC, when they contacted me and wanted the style that I worked in for my Inktober comics, what was great about that is that I designed that style to be really easy for me to produce, because I was doing it for Inktober. And so that was actually like, if I sat down and like really concentrated, I could get 12 pages out in 5 days, like fairly easily. Like, that was like fairly simple. With MAMO, I think I was getting quicker towards the end. The start is always harder. The start, you're like 1 to 2 pages a day at most, and it was painful as all hell. By the end, both because of deadlines and because you're just quicker, I think I was managing about 4 pages of inks a day, 3 to 4 pages of inks a day. But I also work on batches of inks in a way that is like, for all I was like, I work in a linear fashion. I will usually have about 5 pages going at once, and I'll jump between them based on what I want to draw. I'll just be like, I don't want to draw this scene, I'm going to move to this one, and there's a fun face that I can draw here, rather than having to draw the bloody car again. Things like that.
Well, cool. I mean, I like I said, I hope we get something soon, because I like your style, and I like what you got going here. I like your storytelling, and I like your world building, and I like the heart that's involved and the humanity of it all. So I like it. That's all. All right. So the final question is much like the first question. It's the same in every interview. This is a series of interviews. We're probably somewhere in the 200s at this point. And so a lot of people watch these who want to make comics and don't know how to start, what to do, where to go. What would be the piece of advice that you would give someone who says, I'd like to make comics, but I don't quite know what I should do? It can be a practical thing. It can be a philosophical thing. It can be an emotional thing. It can be a self-care thing. What do you got? What's your thought?
I always give the same advice, which is like, I think it's actionable, but maybe it's a bit vague. Which is just that, like I said, like the reason that MAMO exists is because Boom saw a webcomic I was working on when I was like, 19, 20 years old and coming out of university. And so too with DC, like they saw a comic that I was making for fun on Twitter, like, and said, do you want to do a book? And like, what I kind of like, I say this to students a lot, is basically who ask me like, what should I put in my portfolio? Like, what is going to get me like hired? And I think like, the thing about comics, it's sort of the same with animation or any kind of artistic pursuit, is basically that like you've already made the choice to abandon like traditional forms of money making and traditional jobs because you wanted to make something, you wanted to enjoy your work, like that. And I certainly hope none of them made that choice because it was they thought it was a good financial choice, because it's not. It is absolutely not a good financial choice. But it's like, most people are making this choice because like, I want to love my work. I love drawing. I love comics. I love making comics. And so like my biggest word of advice is like, hold on to that and don't compromise that. Because like, I see a lot of people who are like, I've drawn a bunch of like cars to put in my portfolio because people like, then I'll get hired because I can draw cars. And it's like, if you don't want a career drawing cars, don't draw cars. Like, it's like, you're going to have to draw cars if you get hired on the strength of how well you can draw cars. So you better like drawing them. So what I really encourage people to do is like, make stuff you want to make and make stuff that you love. And if you are like, I'm not saying it's a guarantee, there's always going to be a bit of luck involved, but like, then you will, if you're going to get hired, you're going to get hired for stuff that you love making. There is nothing worse than being hired to draw something you hate drawing. It's just like, I might as well get a job in a bank. It's going to give me better benefits. Like, so it's kind of like, it's not to say never expand your skills outside of your comfort zone. Like, absolutely do that. But make sure you keep your head straight about like doing stuff you want to do, because it's why you're in this industry in the first place.
Yeah. Makes sense to me. I like that answer. I like that answer a lot. All right. Let me do a little housekeeping here for everybody at home. I wanna say next month's book is The Peanut Butter Sisters by Rumu Hari. And that's going to be next month's book. This is really good. It's absurd and it's like dream logic comics and it's almost nearly psychedelic, but it's not. I don't know. It's really good. This is a great book. You're going to like this one a lot. The next interview we're doing is the Kids Club, and we're doing Puppy Night by Michael Sweater and Jose Cruz. And this is a fun book, and it's shiny too, as you can see. It's shiny. So those are the next two books coming up. So keep an eye out for those. I want to thank Jordan for being the producer of the show, doing all the backstage stuff. I want to thank Ben for doing the camera work and handling the running of the show things today. I want to thank my staff. I want to thank Zoe, Katie, and Kat for running the store and giving me the ability to sit here and talk to cartoonists. I want to thank all of you who are watching, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching later. It makes a difference. I want to thank all the members of the club. Because it's, again, how we afford to do these things. And I especially want to thank all the artists, especially SAS MILLEDGE, who's right there on that side, for making this wonderful book. If you're sitting at home and you don't know what to read, because we're still in this pandemic thing in a way, people are still needing to read, this is a great book. You're really going to love it. And she's a wonderful creator, and you heard just how thoughtful and smart she is. And, the book is gorgeous, and it was one of the best books of the year. So that's what I have to say. So thank you, SAS. Thank you for being here with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Very good. We'll see everybody next month. Well, next show, but yes, next month.